My fondest gaming memories are from back in the early 90s when I had my Amiga, and I always find that certain developers are synonymous with those great times. TEAM17 are one such developer. Although TEAM17 both developed and published many games during the 90s, we'll be solely looking at the games they developed during this time period. All the games I mentioned were also published by TEAM17 unless otherwise stated. Back then, the British game scene was full of publisher-developer studios that didn't operate with big budgets or huge offices, but sat in small office spaces in dim corners of the country. Rather than having a vast distribution network, they often sold their discs and cassettes in small independent game shops or even in newsagents. 17-bit software fit this description, being based in a tiny office above an amusement park in Wakefield, West Yorkshire. 17-bit software was started by Michael Robinson, who'd been successful with his chain of shops called Microbyte. His simple idea was to find talented young developers, sign their games in the same way that record labels sign bands, and sell those games in his Microbyte shops. One of the first of these young developers to come to their attention was 19-year-old hobbyist Andreas Tadic from Sweden, who was active in the Amiga demo scene and had programmed an Amiga shooter called Half-Bright. He was contacted by Microbyte employee Martin Brown, and it was suggested that he meet with artist Rico Holmes. The two joined forces and, along with Swedish programmer Peter Tulleby, called themselves TEAM17. Their first project together was Miami Chase. Miami Chase was published by Codemasters, who at the time were another up-and-coming British publisher-developer. In the game you play as Don Ferrari, tough cop. At the behest of Miami's mayor and driving a Ferrari F40, you have 48 hours to rid the city of its 7 most prolific crime lords. The objective is to drive around Miami, looking for red cars and shooting them within a time limit for each level, whilst avoiding hitting buildings and other cars, and taking care not to shoot any civilians. Driving erratically in their vicinity will cause other cop cars to pull you over, resulting in loss of precious time. A map of the city is available to you to assist with locating your targets. I've never played Miami Chase, but intend to now, as it looks brilliant, and I was surprised by how much it resembles the original Grand Theft Auto, despite being 7 years older. Following Miami Chase's favourable reception, Brown suggested to Robinson that 17-bit software should not only publish games, but make them too. I mean, they already had a team in place, Holmes as the artist, Tadic and Tulleby as the programmers, and Brown himself as the project manager. Robinson agreed, and Debbie Bestwick was brought in as commercial support for the venture, moving from her position as Microbyte's sales manager. The final piece of the puzzle was to name the new venture, and the names TEAM7 and 17-bit software were merged to create TEAM17. The first game to be released under the new TEAM17 branding was Full Contact on the Amiga in 1991. A one-on-one fighter with some nice graphics, Full Contact's story follows a young boy whose family has been brutally slaughtered at the hands of the Triads. Having witnessed the killing, he escapes but swears to avenge their deaths. Taken in by an order of monks, he is taught self-defense but told never to make full contact. The player makes their way through by fighting each Triad gang member, who are very skilled and often armed with deadly weapons, each increasingly difficult than the last. The time has finally come to avenge your family. The time has come to make full contact. As well as a single player arcade mode where you take on the Triad members, Full Contact offers a multiplayer mode where you can fight against a friend or even compete in tournaments with up to 15 players. Next in 1991 came the hugely popular Alien Breed, self-published on Amiga but published by Microleague when brought over to DOS in 1993. The first in a series of top-down science fiction shooters, Alien Breed could be played by 1 or 2 players. The game was unofficially based on the Alien films, a fact which is obvious when playing the game and even more apparent from the game's box art. The player or player's objective is to locate the lift down to the next level. A variety of weapons can be collected or purchased from the space station's computer terminals, and credits found on the ground can be saved up to spend on these weapons and on other enhancements. Upgrading like this is essential, as the alien hordes become increasingly stronger as the game progresses. In some levels, players are trapped in enclosed spaces with huge boss aliens reminiscent of the Alien Queen. In fact, I bet that 20th Century Fox were kicking themselves that this wasn't an officially licensed Alien game, as it's so bloody good it would have been a worthy tribute to the franchise. Team17 also made an intro disc for Alien Breed, containing a short animated intro with on-screen narration, which follows events leading up to the start of the game. After the introduction is finished, the player is prompted to insert disc 1, effectively making the intro disc disc 0. Alien Breed is one of the games on the list that has aged pretty well gameplay wise, and it's still an absolute blast. In 1992 came Alien Breed Special Edition, which was an expanded version of Alien Breed and was released as a budget title on the Amiga and on Amiga CD32 in a double pack with Quack. It was hugely popular, staying in the British software charts for over a year, and also featured a movie trailer style advert for Team17's upcoming game Superfrog, which, although a staple of the industry today, was unusual at the time. Later the same year came Project X, a horizontal shooter for the Amiga and Amiga CT32, and later ported to DOS. Project X was regarded as one of the best Amiga shooters at the time, both for its excellent graphics and sound, and for its challenging gameplay, which is similar in style to classics of the genre such as Gradius and Salamander. The story is the usual blah 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 fare of shooters, but essentially involves the player battling defective military droids. It's the player's mission to undergo Project X and eliminate the droid forces. Various power-ups allow the player to increase the power of the 7 different weapons: guns, build-up, side shots, homing missiles, plasma, magma and laser beam. These power-ups are numerous in the first level but become increasingly rarer thereafter. Levels have simple but nicely done backgrounds, and settings are quite varied. The game has 5 levels, although many never lived to see the third, as the second level had a balls hard ending. When Team17 realised that the game was perhaps too difficult, they released Project X SE, a budget special edition with reduced difficulty. If you're a fan of horizontal shooters like R-Type, I'd definitely recommend checking out this version. The retail experience they'd had with Microbyte meant that Team17 knew which genres of games would sell better than others, but it was Holmes and Taddick's programming skill and art that turned the concepts into profitable products. Many of the company's early games, such as Full Contact, Alien Breed and Project X, were immediate hits. Within 2 years, Team17 had become the premier developer of games for the Amiga. 90% of the studio's games had reached the #1 spot in the sales charts, and Team17's games accounted for 50% of all Amiga sales. In 1993 came Alien Breed 2: The Horror Continues, the sequel to Alien Breed, for the Amiga and Amiga CD32. Released as 2 versions, including an AGA version, this was the first title that Team17 developed to utilise Commodore's new AGA chipset. The game engine for Alien Breed 2 was overhauled to allow for smoother scrolling between screens, and the graphics were also vastly improved. The sequel also contained more levels and had a steeper difficulty curve. Alien Breed 2 is the only game in the series that gives players the option of choosing between 4 characters, each with their own specific strengths and weaknesses, and each starting with different weapons and slightly different abilities. Next to the Amiga came Body Blows in 1993, which also got a DOS version. A versus fighting game, Body Blows has a lot of similarities to Street Fighter 2. For example, both had 2 characters with projectile, rising uppercut and spinning kick special moves, and played identically, as with Ryu and Ken. Don't expect the game to play as well as Street Fighter 2 of course, although back in 1993 I did very much enjoy it. Body Blows has 3 modes of play: the standard 1-player arcade and 2-player versus modes, and a tournament mode in which 4 or 8 players can compete. Body Blows doesn't hold up too well today, to be brutally honest, but garnered favourable reviews at the time. Later that year to the Amiga came a sequel, Body Blows Galactic, featuring 12 playable characters from 6 worlds and no bosses. As the gameplay system and game modes are almost exactly the same as its predecessor, I won't touch on the game any further. The final game to be released in 1993 was one of their most well known, Superfrog, which came to the Amiga and Amiga CD32 and was later brought to the PC by Ocean. A 2D platform game, the objective of which is to find and defeat a witch, thus rescuing a princess, whilst achieving smaller objectives along the way, such as finding a golden key or escaping from captivity in a circus. Superfrog has 24 levels divided into 6 worlds of differing themes. The goal of each level is to collect a set number of coins and then reach the exit, which will only open if Superfrog has collected enough coins. Extra factors of gameplay include a timer countdown and a number of health points, both of which can be restored by finding bottles of Lucozade among the levels. If you're watching from North America, Lucozade is an energy drink sold here that's similar to Gatorade. Depending on the number of coins and fruit collected, and on how fast the player finishes the level, a number of credits up to a maximum of 15 are awarded at the end of each level. The player can then choose to either exchange these credits for points, or gamble them in a fruit machine style minigame for more bonuses. One interesting function of this minigame is the chance to win a level code, enabling the player to restart the game from the beginning of the next level at a later time. A bonus level between Worlds 5 and 6 takes the form of a side-scrolling shooter called Project F, an homage to Team17's Project X that we saw earlier. Rather than collecting coins, the objective of this stage is to survive to the end. After completing all 6 worlds, the game ends in a castle with a boss fight against the witch. The story, present in the game's manual but mostly conveyed through the introductory animation by Eric W. Schwartz, involves a nameless prince who's turned into a frog by a jealous witch, much like in the classic Frog Prince fairy tale. His princess girlfriend is then abducted by the witch. Feeling sorry for himself, down by the River O' Despair, the prince happens upon a floating bottle of Lucozade, which of course gives him superpowers. Superfrog is still worth a bash if you're a fan of platformers, and is in my opinion one of the Amiga's finest. In 1993, Team17 won a Golden Joystick Award for Software House of the Year, which they shared with EA, who were huge in comparison. Released in 1994 for the Amiga, Amiga CD32 and DOS, Alien Breed Tower Assault was the third game in the Alien Breed franchise and the last 2D game in the series. After intercepting a distress signal from a science facility on an otherwise uninhabited planet, a small troop of soldiers take ships to investigate and search for survivors. After the ships are attacked by automated laser turrets, only 2 soldiers survive after crash landing, and it's these 2 soldiers that the player controls. The engine is a slightly improved version of the one used in Alien Breed 2. There are now multiple exits for each level, making the game far less linear than previous entries in the series. The back of the game's box claims that there are a whopping 276 possible ways of completing the game. Other improvements include retreat mode, which allows the player to shoot and walk backwards at the same time, albeit at a slower speed. Next in 1994 came Arcade Pool, which was released for the Amiga and also DOS and Amiga CD32 later on, although Team17 didn't port the DOS version. A top-down pool simulator with a surprisingly accurate physics, Arcade Pool featured many UK and US variations of pool. Lacking any real-world pool star names, computer-controlled players were named after members of Team17 staff, with Martin Brown being the most difficult. The computer-controlled players with the lowest difficulty are all named after staff of Amiga gaming magazine Amiga Power, adding more fuel to their rivalry. You see, Team17 had disputes with Amiga Power all throughout the 90s, and haven't really touched on that yet, but more about that later. The final game from 1994 is Ultimate Body Blows, released for Amiga CD32 and DOS. It's essentially a merging of the previous 2 games, Body Blows and Body Blows Galactic, featuring characters and locations from both. Nothing more needs to be said about that really. In 1995, Team17 made a deal with Ocean, meaning that Ocean would co-publish their games worldwide. The first game released under this agreement was Alien Breed 3D. Alien Breed 3D is the 4th game in the franchise, released for Amiga and Amiga CD32, and is notable for being the first game in the series to be a first-person shooter, and also the first game that Team17 would not self-publish, as it was published by Ocean, as previously mentioned. Alien Breed 3D has levels of varying depths, with platforms and floors above others, something that the Doom engine was not capable of doing. In fact, Alien Breed 3D was the first Doom-esque Amiga game. Team17 did a fantastic job bringing the Alien Breed franchise into 3 dimensions, and the game certainly does a lot of things right. The graphics are very outdated by today's standards, but the gameplay was solid and challenging, and the sound was very well executed. Alien Breed 3D was ranked as the 12th best Amiga game of all time in Amiga Power. Next up in 1995 came isometric racing game ATR All-Terrain Racing for the Amiga and Amiga CD32. The game is what I describe as a cross between Micro Machines and Super Off-Road with some nice graphics. Some of the tracks, particularly the snowy ones, actually remind me of Cannon Fodder's visual style. ATR's vehicles are buggies, although slightly futuristic in style, and their handling was based on drifting around corners and slamming into opponents. Much like Micro Machines and Super Off-Road, the tracks have hazards such as jumps and oil slicks, and the player can pick up turbos that are littered around the track like in Super Off-Road. Unlike other races of the time, ATR had shortcuts which could be used to save time. Simple but fun and quite challenging, ATR is a great little racing game. Again in 1995 came Kingpin Arcade Sports Bowling, which is obviously a bowling game with support for up to 6 human or computer controlled players. Controls are simple, with a power gauge that can be altered by pressing up and down, and pressing left and right changes the position of your character. Hitting enter once shows an arrow indicating the direction in which the ball will travel, and hitting enter once more will throw the ball. Again, as with Arcade Pool, the easiest challenges were named after Amiga Power staff members. The ongoing dispute with Amiga Power escalated during this period in 1995 after the magazine's reviewer Jonathan Nash gave TEAM17's games ATR and Kingpin 38 and 47% respectively. 38% was half of what ATR had been receiving in reviews elsewhere, having generally received scores in the 80s. So, where exactly did this rivalry with Amiga Power start in the first place? Amiga Power had a policy of giving a 50% score to an average game, instead of 73% to keep game producers happy, a practice which most other reviewers followed. Disagreeing with Amiga Power's review policy, TEAM17 responded by putting several Easter eggs into their games. For example, typing Amiga Power into Alien Breed 2 would display a message criticising Amiga Power's review policy, and as mentioned previously, the easiest characters in Arcade Pool and Kingpin were named after Amiga Power staff members. In response to Amiga Power's low scoring of ATR and Kingpin, TEAM17 filed a libel action demanding the magazine stop, quote, lying about their games. TEAM17 issued a lawsuit demanding that the reviews be officially retracted and the issue withdrawn from sale, said former Amiga Power writer Stuart Campbell. The suggestion was laughed out of the office. The lawsuit never came to anything, but TEAM17 stopped sending Amiga Power copies of its games for review, and even forbade other magazines from lending them their review copies. To review TEAM17's games, they actually had to go to the shops to buy them, which of course meant that their reviews appeared later than everyone else's. By the mid-90s, TEAM17 had bigger problems than poor review scores. The Amiga, the computer on which TEAM17 had built their business, was in trouble. In 1994, Commodore had filed for bankruptcy. At the time, TEAM17 was a fair way into production on a long project called King of Thieves. TEAM17 was forced to drop King of Thieves and change its tactics, or faced dying along with Commodore. At the European Computer Trade Show in 1994, young hobbyist Andy Davidson brought his artillery-style game called Total Wormage to TEAM17's booth. The game was originally created as an entry for a Blitz basic programming competition run by Amiga Format, although it didn't win. It was also rejected by several publishers prior to Davidson taking it to the trade show. TEAM17 immediately realised its potential, and that evening Brown and Bestwick met with him in a local bar and continued playing the game. From the minute we saw the game, we couldn't stop playing, said Bestwick. We knew we had something, but no one knew just how big it was going to become. TEAM17 agreed to sign the game at the show, and shortly afterwards began work on a commercial release, although with the simplified name of Worms. With the Amiga dying out, TEAM17 knew that if the game were to succeed, it would have to be a multi-platform release. We knew the game needed to be on every platform possible, and we had zero console experience on the publishing side, said Bestwick. We started talks with Ocean and Virgin Games, who are the two biggest multi-platform publishers in the UK. We chose Ocean. The game launched later that year not only on the Amiga but also on Sega's Mega Drive and Saturn, the Super Nintendo, PC and PlayStation among other platforms. Team17 even started work on a port for Nintendo's Virtual Boy, which was axed very early on due to the console being discontinued. In early 1995, Ocean estimated that Worms would sell around 60,000 copies, but it ended up selling millions in the first year. Worms pretty much saved Team17. Worms is a turn-based game where the player controls a team of worms against other teams of worms that are human or computer controlled. The aim is to use your arsenal of weapons and equipment to kill all of the opposing worms, leaving your own team as the last worm or worms standing. The game's graphics and sound design are very cartoony in nature. Levels are randomly generated by tweaking various different object and landscape settings, which are arranged into themes, including forests, Martian landscapes, beaches and hell. The turn-based gameplay makes for a ridiculously fun multiplayer game, with only one controller being needed to play as it's passed around between turns. Treaties are inevitably made between friends if a rival gains too much of a lead and needs taking down a peg, and revenge attacks are commonplace if someone feels they've been picked on by another player. The brilliant thing is that whatever your chosen strategy, anything can happen. Worms is, in my opinion, one of the greatest local multiplayer games ever made. As soon as I played it on my Amiga I was hooked, just as Team17 had been back when they play tested the game at the trade show. Since then, I've pretty much never stopped playing it in one iteration or another. A few of the subsequent games in the series veered from the traditional setup, and for that reason I liked them less, as I think that they got the gameplay right the first time. Thankfully, recent iterations have gone back to the traditional 2D style and classic gameplay that made Worms the game that we grew to love. I still play them on my PS4, and gameplay isn't too dissimilar to the original, albeit with enhanced graphics and sound. Moving into 1996, their next game was Alien Breed 3D 2, The Killing Grounds, the fifth game in Team17's Alien Breed franchise, and again published by Ocean. Originally intended to be Team17's final Amiga game, it ended up being their penultimate title due to Worms the Director's Cut's release the following year. Following the success of Alien Breed 3D, Team17 were aiming higher with its sequel, hoping to make something for the Amiga on par with the Quake engine. The release included two versions of the game spread over 5 discs, one with high quality sound and textures, and the other with reduced quality. The reduced version was supposed to be able to run on a non-expanded Amiga 1200, although the game ran slowly. Sadly, the project turned out to be a bit too ambitious. Most Amigas at the time struggled to run the game, even with upgraded RAM and accelerator cards, so the majority of Amiga gamers have only been able to play the game in recent years using emulation. An editor was shipped with the game, allowing users to create their own levels, but Alien Breed 3D 2 was criticised for having poor level design and no collision detection, and repetitive sound effects. Hey, at least they tried. Now we move into 1997 and begin to leave Team17's Amiga era. Their first game that year was X2 for Sony's PlayStation, published by Ocean but by Capcom in Japan. X2, sometimes known as Project X2, is a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up and the sequel to the Amiga shooter Project X. A PlayStation exclusive, X2 did have a Saturn port in the works, but this was scrapped. The intro, which at the time was very impressive, shows your character, a retired pilot, being called out of retirement as he's one of the best and last remaining pilots qualified to oppose the invading aliens. The game is visually striking, with enemies and weapons being big and bold, with no notable slowdown, although the backdrops are rather bland in comparison. The soundtrack's decent, featuring several original techno-style tracks, but I find the sound effects to be a bit tinny and unexciting. Gameplay is standard shooter fare, with the player collecting power-ups and dodging enemy fire. X2 had some good attributes and is quite a challenge, so would appeal to hardcore fans of side-scrolling shooters, but certainly isn't the best the genre has to offer. Later in 1997 came the first Windows game in this list, Worms 2, published by Microprose. Very similar gameplay wise to the first Worms, Worms 2 was the first game in the series to feature completely integrated local and online multiplayer, in addition to the regular pass and play multiplayer option of its predecessor. Worms 2 also includes both weapon and option editors, each adding a high level of customization to gameplay and weapon settings. Option settings include worm retreat time, wind strength and fall damage, and weapon settings include how many turns must pass before a weapon becomes available, the number of bullets fired per shot, blast power, explosion radius and bullet spread. The game offers players the ability to create their own custom teams, with each team having its own name, and includes 8 individually named worms. The player can also change the team's voice set. This was great fun, and I'm sure we've all made ridiculous teams with equally absurdly named worms in them. Well, I know I have. Worms 2 includes a random level generator and a basic level editor. All in all, it built on an already fantastic idea and just polished it rather than trying to overhaul the mechanics like some later entries in the series did. Next in '97 came TEAM17's final Amiga release, Worms: The Director's Cut, again published by Ocean. For the Director's Cut, Andy Davidson built upon the original Worms, enhancing the engine, graphics and gameplay. Developed solely for AGA Amiga systems, it was designed to utilise the advanced graphics that these systems could produce. Davidson wanted to improve the original Worms to the best possible quality, saying, "What I'm trying to do here is create the best Amiga game ever. It will also be the best version of the original Worms available on any platform." There are 14 new weapons added in the Director's Cut, including the Holy Hand Grenade, a staple of the series thereafter. Notable alterations to levels include the addition of caverns, allowing for matches to be played within caves, and a more advanced level editor. Graphical upgrades include an increase in the number of on-screen colours, upping it to 300, and 9-level parallax scrolling. The Director's Cut received positive reviews from critics and gamers, but sold a mere 5,000 copies worldwide. The last game we'll look at is 1998's Addiction Pinball. This was published by Microprose for PC under the name Addiction Pinball, but was ported to the PlayStation by Infogrames, who had recently acquired Microprose under the name Worms Pinball. As the name suggests, it's a pinball simulation game featuring tables based on 2 games published by TEAM17, Worms and World Rally Fever. In the table based on Worms, the aim is to complete missions and collect weapons in order to increase your rank and move on to the next area, of which there are 5, Arctic, Mars, Jungle, Desert and Hell. The World Rally Fever table is based around the theme of car racing and maintenance. The aim in this table, besides achieving the highest score, is to take part in various races. An abridged version for the PC was also released in 1998, again titled Worms Pinball, which doesn't contain the World Rally Fever table, and was published by TEAM17 on Steam in 2012 if you wanted to check it out. Addiction Pinball is okay visually and has some good sound, but it lacks depth in my opinion, especially the cut down Worms Pinball version, which just has the one table. More of a quick blast sort of game rather than something you can sink your teeth into. So that's where we'll leave the story of TEAM17, but they were by no means finished. Think back to all the studios that you loved in the late 80s and 90s. Ocean, Gremlin, Psygnosis and countless others are all sadly gone, but TEAM17 has survived despite coming very close to closure at least twice. Since 1998 they've released at least 20 games in the Worms franchise on a multitude of platforms, right up to the recent Worms WMD in 2016. But for this reason they risked becoming a one-trick pony developer. In the 2000s, TEAM17 not only developed games for their own franchises but for other publishers too, porting Lemmings to the PSP and creating Leisure Suit Larry Box Office Bust in 2009. During this period they were also shortlisted for British Developer of the Year by the Golden Joystick Awards. 2009 also saw a return to their classic Alien Breed franchise with the launch of Alien Breed Evolution. The company saw some restructuring in 2010, and in 2013 they made the decision to diversify, moving away from Worms, although not entirely, and go back to their roots by finding and publishing new indie games alongside their main releases. For example, TEAM17 worked with Chris Davis, a former roofer, who designed the BAFTA-nominated The Escapists, or is it The Escapists, which went on to sell over 1.2 million copies. TEAM17 is to this day an independent game developer with dozens of staff members making it one of the longest surviving independent developers, having seen their 25th anniversary in 2015. Over 25 years on from their first outing on the Amiga, TEAM17 is one of the only surviving British studios left from that era, an era of which I'm very fond. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in the series, you can check out my other developer spotlight videos by clicking these links.